One of the best questions I've had so far this morning is where exactly did the Union Army hit? Which means I think we have a misconception of the size of 20,000 men. You can imagine 20,000 men in the field in front of you. They hit everywhere. Their aim, their objective point was the salient, primarily the tip of the salient. But when you have a sledgehammer of 20,000 men, they're going to wash over all of these works, everything that you could see from the far ridge. All of this space that we're currently standing in is going to be washed over by Union soldiers. The Union onrush is going to sweep over this, as Hancock said, like an irresistible wave. And as it sweeps up most of the Confederates occupying the trenches here, many of them are going to be captured. McHenry Howard, who's a Marylander here in the Muleshoe, said soon a cloud of blue uniforms came pressing down from our left, along our works, in front of them, and by far the greater number completely filling up the space within the angle and so directly in our rear. Howard is going to be down along this line, and his unit is entirely swept up in this attack. Hancock's report will cite the capture of 4,000 prisoners, 20 pieces of artillery, about 30 colors, and 2 generals. Most of that happening just in the first minutes of this attack, as the Confederates are caught off guard, as they are overwhelmed by the Union advance. The experience of being captured, if you're along this line, is harrowing. Howard, who is captured, said, "I retained my sword in hand after some hesitation whether or not to throw it away or stick it in the ground. One man took it out of my hand, and another came up while he was doing so, and drawing a large clasped knife from his pocket and opening it, I wondered if he was going to stab me. He cut the scabbard from my leather belt, and they went their several ways with their trophies. We were ordered to the rear." Along with staff officers like McHenry Howard, caught up in this wave of attack are two Confederate generals. The first, Edward Allegheny Johnson. Frank had a brief description of Johnson. Johnson has spent an extremely restless night. He believes the reports that an attack is forming out in front of his line, and he is waiting. Spends the entire evening nervously waiting for an attack, sleeping in his clothes. When the attack comes, there is an excellent report of Johnson standing on these very works with his most famous tool, a hickory walking stick. It had, at some point in time, earned him the nickname Old Clubby. And he is putting that old club to good use this morning. He is parrying blows from Union bayonets. And what's more, he's beating them down with it. One man wrote, "I could see General Johnson with his cane striking at the enemy as they leaped over the works. And a sputtering fire swept up and down our line, many guns being danced. I also saw General Johnson with his cane striking in the crowd and warding bayonets." Perhaps not the most effective weapon out here on the battlefield, but an inspiring scene nonetheless. But he is swept up in this attack soon after. Many men wrote it was a miracle that he was not killed as he's standing on the works using his walking stick. He's swept up, taken to the rear of Union lines, at which point he has an interview with Winfield Scott Hancock. Hancock knew Johnson from before the war, and so offered his hand and said, "General Johnson, I am glad to see you." Johnson replied, "General Hancock, this is worse than death to me." Hancock replied, "This is the fate of war, General, and you must not forget that you are a soldier." But it was a rough morning for Allegheny Johnson, as it had been a rough night the day before. One man looking at him said, "At this time, his appearance was rough indeed, some of his rather scanty, sandy-colored hair sticking through a rent in his old slouch hat. He was belaboring the men behind the works with a stick, so I was told, to make them stand up when captured, and came near being killed by paying no heed to calls to surrender." Johnson found many uses for his walking stick that morning. As Johnson is back in the rear, listening to Hancock report his gains, he's deeply affected. He realizes that these are his men who were captured. And one man on the scene said that Johnson put his hand to his heart as though it pained him. And as he gazed upon his fellow prisoners and earthworks, which but an hour before were under his command, heavy tears coursed down his cheeks, and his whole frame heaved with emotion. So we talked a little bit about the weight of command earlier in considering the Union soldiers here and the Union officers. But keep in mind that that bond goes on both sides. Allegheny Johnson realizes that his men are his responsibility. And although he did his very best to prepare them for what was to come, he is ultimately feeling what has happened. Very personally, it affects him. As he looks around at his men, he realizes that ultimately he is the one responsible for their fates. But another general is swept up here as well during the attack. Frank mentioned earlier George Maryland Stewart. Stewart is also captured quickly in these works. He is swept up so early that he is a little bit surprised. He finds someone who is demanding his surrender and says, it's Colonel Beaver, by the way, the 148th Pennsylvania, and he says, I would like to surrender to an officer of rank. I am General Stewart. Beaver answers, what? Are you Jeb Stewart? Thinking he'd really caught a prize. I don't imagine that George Stewart was quite as amused. He said, no, I am George H. Stewart. Beaver said, I will accept your surrender. Where is your sword, sir? Stewart said, well, sir, in a melancholy tone of regret with a tinge of the comic, you all waked us up so early this morning that I didn't have time to get it on. And so Stewart is taken to the rear as well. Hancock in turn offers his hand to Stewart when he arrived at headquarters. But Stewart said, under existing circumstances, sir, I cannot take your hand. Hancock snaps back. Under any other circumstances, sir, it would not have been offered. You can imagine that Stewart's experience as a prisoner was not quite as good as Allegheny Johnson's experience as a prisoner. But Stewart, despite his lack of gentlemanly bearing in that moment, shows his class later on. When he's looking back at his men, again, remember this bond between officers and men. He looks around at his men that have been captured and says, men, keep up your spirits. You will hear all sorts of reports, but do not believe them or be discouraged by anything. Remember always that you are Confederate soldiers. So again, we see this bond between officers and men. And we also see an interesting contrast in characters between Johnson and Stewart, how they each cope with adversity, with the situation of being captured. Stewart is so enraged at being captured that he is so strongly devoted to remaining enemies with the men who have captured him. He is quite bitter. Johnson, however, accepts the reality, to some degree, of being captured and takes it with a large dose of humility. Now, also in this area, about to be captured, is artillery. Remember how Frank described the foot race between the artillery and the Union Second Corps. I can tell you that although they're going to arrive at similar times, I would say the Second Corps wins the foot race because most of those guns are going to be rushed right back here only to be captured. Some guns had remained in the salient. Carrington's battery of 4 Napoleons was in place when the attack hit. Allegheny Johnson had admonished Carrington to remain vigilant, to expect an attack. And Carrington's battery had been able to fire 25 to 30 rounds before they were captured. But in the end, most of the artillery, as well as Carrington's battery, is going to be swept up in the attack and captured. 20 guns total are going to be captured here in the salient. Along with those cannon and those generals and those men, you also have several flags being captured. Robert Robertson of the 93rd New York wrote, once the rebel colors floated out with the wind until it could be grasped by one of our boys. The brave color bearer rose to his feet, clinging to the staff. Our brave boy also rises, clinging to the flag, and with disengaged hands they seek to grasp each other's throats in a deadly struggle for the flag. Thus they stand over the very rampart, both determined to win the flag. By common consent, firing ceased at that point, and both sides eagerly watch and encourage the fray. Finally, the flag is torn from its staff, and its proud captor, with its shattered arm, is hailed with shouts of applause. So several stands of Confederate colors are going to be captured in the midst of the chaos as this attack hits the lines. These are incredible losses for Robert E. Lee. Cannot overemphasize how serious these losses are. On May 10th, Emory Upton had captured about 1,000 prisoners. Now, 3,000 to 4,000 more prisoners are taken by the Union Second Corps, as well as 2 generals and 20 cannon. These are unsustainable losses. Even if Lee is able to hold this line, as he will desperately try to do so, he's already taken an extremely deep blow that he's going to have to recover from as his army continues the fight. But here in the Muleshoe, in just the very first minutes of this attack, we've seen scenes of heroism and desperation, courage and cowardice. And in the chaos, how do you understand this? Later, how do you recognize this? And so for a word about the several things gained in this Muleshoe salient, we're going to turn things over to Pete for just a moment. Pete?
So as Beth just described, there were numerous prisoners of war, generals, cannon, and flags all captured in the initial stages of this assault. A Union soldier who captured a flag in battle would usually become the recipient of the highest award for valor in action against an enemy force, which can be bestowed upon an individual serving in the armed forces of the United States, that being the Congressional Medal of Honor. The Army Medal of Honor was established in July of 1862 to be presented in the name of Congress to such non-commissioned officers and privates as shall most distinguish themselves by their gallantry in action and other soldier-like qualities. This was opened up and extended to include officers in March of 1863. A total of 43 Medals of Honor were presented for actions during the Battle of Spotsylvania Courthouse. Half of them, 22 to be exact, occurred in just this initial assault on the Muleshoe. So during approximately 1 hour span of time in this general vicinity has to be one of the most concentrated periods of Medal of Honor actions performed in American military history. Every one of those 22 citations were for flag captures. It's impossible for us to know the circumstances for each one of those captures, what surrounds those. Some of them note capturing flags in personal encounters or hand-to-hand combat. It is also possible that some of these flags may have been lying about, their bearers had become casualties, and the captor picked up the banners off the ground. But we do have a few of these citations that include additional details on these deeds of valor. I'll read a few of those for you now. Sergeant Charles S. Fall, 26 Michigan. 26 Michigan was credited as the 1st Regiment over the works, Nelson Miles Brigade. He was one of the first to mount the Confederate works, where he bayoneted 2 of the enemy and captured a Confederate flag, but threw it away to continue the pursuit of the enemy. Private George W. Harris, 148th Pennsylvania, commanded by Colonel Beaver, that's Brooks Brigade. He was cited for capture of a flag, wresting it from the color bearer, and shooting an officer who attempted to regain it. First Lieutenant Charles McNally, 69th Pennsylvania, that's Owens, Philadelphia Brigade, in a hand-to-hand encounter with the enemy, captured a flag, was wounded in the act, but continued on duty until he received a second wound. This was all on his 28th birthday, by the way. Corporal Alexander McHale, 26th Michigan, the 1st Regiment over the works again, captured a Confederate color in a charge, threw the flag in front of the works, which I'm guessing maybe threw it back to the Federal side, and continued in the charge upon the enemy. Keep in mind, these are guys who probably realized that if you come back with a flag, you could get potentially a medal, and they're throwing them down to continue their job in this assault. So, the last one I'll read here is Private Christopher W. Wilson, 73rd New York Brewster's Brigade, took the flag from the wounded color bearer, that being of his own unit. So he picks up the flag of his own unit, carried it in the charge over the Confederate works, in which charge he also captured the colors of the 56th Virginia, bringing off both flags in safety. So he saved the flag of his own regiment, and then he goes ahead and captures an enemy flag as well. I'm imagining when he got back to the main line that had both flags, it's probably a sight to see. Now, this last citation has an interesting detail. It said he captured the colors of the 56th Virginia. 56th Virginia was in Pickett's division, not at Spotsylvania Courthouse. There's a number of these Medal of Honor citations which list the capture of flags from Confederate regiments which were not at this battle. This is most likely due to some errors in the numerical designations of these units, or has to do with the fact that many of these medals were presented decades after the war, and the specifics have become a little bit hazy, I guess. Of these 22 citations, 14 were issued during the war. The rest were all issued post-war. But all in all, just a rundown on of these 22. There were 12 privates, 3 corporals, 4 sergeants, 1 first sergeant, and 2 lieutenants. We had 3 Michiganders, 2 Ohioans, 9 New Yorkers, 8 Pennsylvanians. 6 of them had been born in Ireland, 1 in Prussia. The rest were American-born. The youngest was 16-year-old Private Archibald Freeman of the 124th New York. Now, as I mentioned, all these medals were for flag captures, but one has to kind of wonder how many other deeds of valor worthy of medals of honor were also performed that morning. The intensity, the close nature of the fighting here at dawn on May 12th certainly witnessed countless acts of bravery and heroism that could qualify for Medal of Honor citations. We will never know the specifics of all those, but through these few citations, we get a better idea how some of them played out right where we're standing now 150 years ago. With that, I will pass it back over to Frank and Beth.
Just a quick word. We've been talking a lot about chaos and confusion, getting caught up in the attack, losses and gains, and I'm afraid that one of you have had a loss, and we've had a gain of a pair of glasses. Has anybody lost their glasses in our tour so far? Anybody? If you do find that you have lost your glasses, please come see me. And with that, we're going to move on with Frank to our next stop, back toward the angle.
Do you have time for a quick question?
Sure.
Those 20 guns, okay, do we have any more details? That's a big loss. If they were here, they could have done some real damage.
No.
Did they just get up here and we're not ready to fire, and that's why they were captured? Or did they get off a shot? Or do we know this? Or would it not have mattered because of the federal onrush?
It's going to be a mixture of that. Some of them are going to get in place just in time to be captured. Some of them might fire a shot or two. None of them are going to be able to make a real difference in their arrival. The ones that are quickly streaming back. The ones that are already here, they do get off. I think I said 20 to 25 shots.
You did.
Carrington's battery here is able to make some headway.
So if they were all left here before, there'd been a lot more headway about.
Yes. Remember that it's the artillery that beats back Mott's assault on May 10th.
You think it would have stopped it? I don't think it would have stopped it.
I don't think it would have stopped it, but it would have made a difference.
Okay,
that's for
thank
sure.
you.
No problem.
50 years ago, Union soldiers breached the Confederate line in the last half hour. You have been precisely on the measure of their time. You went across the works this morning at exactly the time they went across the works. As the fighting swirled around the east angle, around the apex of this Confederate mule shoe salient, this part of the Confederate line was largely oblivious to that breakthrough. To look back from whence you came, it would have been impossible to see the rest of the Confederate line. You could hear it, you could sense it, but you could not take a measure of it. Where we are located, you have just walked along the line of the Louisiana Brigade. Colonel William Monahan's brigade used to be Harry Hayes's troops, but Hayes was felled by a sharpshooter in the erection of these works. And now Monahan's men were located in those bottoms. For Monahan's fellows, one Confederate said that they were startled by the sound like the roaring of a tempestuous sea that came over those earthworks. And one of those Louisiana soldiers shouted out the direful warning, "Look out, boys, we will have blood for supper." And in fact, a truly prophetic statement. Their troops were inundated, not only from Union troops coming over the earthworks, directly in front, Union attackers from Birney's division, but Barlow's men insinuating their way up the trench, firing down the trench, firing from traverse to traverse. And Barlow's men getting into the woods behind us. Monahan's Louisianans disintegrate. And then the fight centers on this hilltop. On this hill was the Stonewall Brigade. Virginians who in 1861 stood on Henry House Hill with Thomas Jonathan Jackson. And while Stonewall Jackson gained his nom de guerre, Jackson always professed that it was the troops who had earned the name. Those troops were led here by a brigadier general named James A. Walker. Walker and Jackson had known each other prior to the war. They had a history with each other. Walker tried to kill Jackson. He had been a cadet that was relieved from the Virginia Military Institute because of Professor Jackson. He had challenged Jackson to a duel to which the professor had declined, since they were not of comparable rank. As Walker would have no rank, that just rubbed salt into the wounds. The superintendent of VMI had to send a telegram to Walker's father in Stanton, Virginia, to come take his son away before the law would take his son away. In 1861, Walker joined up as a private. Mrs. Jackson was alarmed. She begged her husband to send him elsewhere, to dismiss him, to put him in someone else's command. And Jackson, rather naively, or perhaps with deep insight, said there was nothing to worry about, that Walker was a good man, and that they were there for a good cause. In a very short time, Jackson took Walker under his wing and gave him rank and elevated him to the point where he was a brigadier general. And he had become the commander of Jackson's prestigious command, the Stonewall Brigade. And the brigade loved Walker. They loved and esteemed him as they had Stonewall Jackson himself. And they proved it by giving him a nickname, one that is the perfect hallmark. He too was called Stonewall. Stonewall Jim Walker. Stonewall Jim Walker, his career ends on this hilltop. He, among many Confederates that morning, this hour, fell under the blazing fire of this Union attack. As he was carted off this hilltop and taken down through the woods towards a hospital, he may very well have been one of the very last men to leave this spot and get out. There are others who fell wounded here, and one member of the 4th Virginia Infantry who had suffered a slight wound, a significant wound, was tapped by his captain and ordered to the rear. Moments later, the captain was chagrined to see this man return to the earthworks and resume his position. Confused, the officer asked, "Did I not send you to the rear?" To which he was answered, "There is no rear." This spot became surrounded. The Stonewall Brigade was able to hold Union soldiers in front of us at bay for a period of time. But there is nothing about these trenches that protect them from fire in the rear. Lieutenant J.S. Dole, 33rd Virginia. The scene here was terrible. The figures of the men seemed dimly through the smoke, and the fog seemed almost gigantic, whilst the woods were lighted with the flashing of guns and the sparkling of musketry. James McCown, 4th Virginia Infantry. We fought desperately, not dreaming of capture, until we were completely surrounded by the overwhelming numbers. And as this brigade, like all the others below us, became surrounded, inundated, overwhelmed, they ceased to exist. Edward Johnson's division of 4,000 men has in the last hour disappeared, vanished off the battlefield, vanished off the map, and along with them, the entire center of the Confederate line has vanished. This overarching mule shoe, this salient, has been breached, and the center of the line no longer exists. As one Confederate said, the keystone in our entire arch has been taken away. And as Union soldiers flood across the field, wash over top of the earthworks like a resistless tidal wave, Robert E. Lee is to the rear, trying to make sense out of what is happening in the fog. One of Ed Johnson's staff officers, a major named Robert Hunter, has somehow managed to escape the melee on this hilltop and grab one of the captured Confederate artillery horses. As he dashed to the rear, he saw Robert E. Lee trying to rally the men in the field just beyond these woods in the McCool farm. And it was obvious to Hunter that Lee didn't know what was going on. And as he rode up to him, he shouted, "General, the entire line is breached." And at that moment, Hunter said, Lee's countenance changed. In that moment, Robert Edward Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia were facing the gravest crisis of their entire existence. The Confederate right wing is no longer physically connected to the Confederate left wing. And there are Union soldiers pouring into a deep wedge between them. If Robert E. Lee did not do something drastic in the immediacy of this moment, all would be lost. Union soldiers sensed it as much as Lee himself. As one Union officer led his men over these earthworks, he encouraged his men by saying, "Wide awake, boys! The last day of the rebellion is at hand." And Robert E. Lee feared that that might be true. What Lee does in the next hour will determine whether this is the last day of the rebellion, the last day of the Army of Northern Virginia, the last day of the Civil War in Virginia. This is just the beginning. This touches off a firestorm that will consume these woods and this hilltop and a little bend in the earthworks, which is soon to become the Bloody Angle, the eye of the storm, a hurricane that sweeps everything and everybody around us. And as Michigan Officer Rufus Dole said, this would be the most terrible 24 hours of the Civil War, an ongoing saga that consumed everything over the next 22 hours on this heartbreaking landscape. We remember this today. You have come out before dawn to walk in their footsteps. I imagine that most of you will stay with us. Flag retiring. All to remember this day, I expect that many of you will be going on many a walking tour today. You will walk this land that was made famous precisely 150 years ago. Be standing at those spots at precisely the moments they became significant to us. You've made a pilgrimage to come from many miles to be here, to stand here at those moments. And I thank you, because you are the continuum of history. You are the ones who validate what they did 150 years ago just by your presence. They mattered because you mattered. In remembrance of this, throughout the day, for the next 22 hours, we will have a presence here at the Bloody Angle, remembering this fight. A silent sentinel will hold post here throughout that entire 22 hours. Every half hour,